This is the story of Adrian James Cole and his wife, Brielle Elaine Cole. They had built something that looked, from the outside, like a life anyone would want. 8 years of marriage, a house with good bones. 2 incomes that had quietly grown into one empire managed almost entirely by Adrian's careful, unhurried hands. The trouble with careful men is that they rarely announce themselves. They simply hold things together until, one day, they don't. Brielle had always known in the abstract way one knows the weight of the air before a storm, that Adrian's steadiness was not the same as his happiness. She had chosen, for reasons she would later struggle to articulate honestly, to treat that distinction as unimportant. What unravels here is not simply a marriage, it is the slow, expensive education of a woman who confused reliability with devotion, and a man who confused silence with strength. The Saturday mornings had a shape to them, and Brielle had long since stopped noticing it. Adrian would be up first always, without exception, without an alarm. By the time she came downstairs in the oversized cardigan she'd stolen from him 3 winters ago and never returned, the coffee would be made, the kitchen would be clean, and he would be at the table with his laptop open, reading something she never asked about, financial news mostly, sometimes policy documents. Once, she glanced over his shoulder and seen a 40-page actuarial report and thought, absently, God, how does he not die of boredom? And then gone to check her phone. He would look up when she entered. He always looked up. Morning, he'd say. Morning, she'd say back. And that was, more often than not, the most direct exchange they had before noon. It hadn't always been this way. In the early years, those Saturday mornings had been loud, cartoonishly domestic. The kind of mornings that felt lifted from a film about people who were genuinely, embarrassingly happy. She used to sit across from him and steal his toast, and he used to pretend to be annoyed. He used to read things aloud to her, random facts, strange headlines, a paragraph from whatever book he was working through. She used to actually listen. She wasn't sure when she'd stop listening. She suspected he wasn't sure either, though she also suspected he'd noted the date somewhere, in the precise and private accounting he kept of things that mattered. Adrian Cole was 41 years old, and he was the kind of man who was invisible in rooms where he didn't want to be seen. Not unpleasant, never that. He was well-dressed in a way that suggested he'd made a single, well-researched decision about his wardrobe, and then committed to it permanently. He smiled easily, but not excessively. He remembered names, kept promises, and had never in 8 years raised his voice at his wife. Not once. Brielle had mentioned this to her friend Cassandra once, meaning it as a compliment, and Cassandra had tilted her head slightly and said, "Does that ever feel strange?" And Brielle had laughed it off. She thought about that now sometimes. Cassandra's head tilting. Brielle was 38, and she was the kind of woman who filled a room, not through volume, but through presence, through a quality of attention she could direct at a person that made them feel, temporarily, like the only interesting thing in the world. She worked in brand strategy and was very good at it. She understood narrative, understood how to make things look like what they needed to look like. She had, without quite realizing it, applied this skill to her marriage, constructing a version of it for public consumption that was tidier and warmer than the one she actually lived in. She loved Adrian. She was fairly certain of that. What she was less certain of was whether she was still in love with him, and whether that distinction mattered as much as everyone seemed to think it did. And whether the question itself was a symptom of something she should address, or simply the natural weather pattern of a long marriage. She had not addressed it. Their neighbor, Marcus Webb, had been around more this past year. He'd moved into the cul-de-sac following a divorce amicable, he said, the word everyone uses, and he was the sort of person who found reasons to knock on doors, borrowing things, returning things, asking about contractors, stopping by with a bottle of wine after a neighborhood thing wrapped up early. He was funny, brash in a way that Adrian was not. He took up space loudly and seemed to enjoy the effect this had on people. Adrian had helped him set up his home network once, spent an entire afternoon doing it, and when Marcus had offered to pay, Adrian had waved it off with the quiet magnanimity that was simply his way. Marcus had, since then, consistently directed his social energy toward Brielle. Adrian noticed. He didn't say anything. That evening of Friday in early October, the light going gold and then gone, They were sitting on the back porch after dinner, and Brielle said, "Marcus invited us to Joanna Hartley's party next weekend, the one at the vineyard." Adrian looked at his glass. "I know." "You know? He mentioned it when I saw him at the hardware store Tuesday." She paused. "You didn't say anything." "I'm saying something now," Adrian said, and his voice was perfectly even, and he wasn't looking at her. And the evening was very quiet except for the sound of something moving through the hedge at the yard's edge, a bird maybe, or just the wind making a decision. The drive to the vineyard took 40 minutes, and they spent most of it in a silence that had its own specific texture. Not hostile, not comfortable, but occupied. The kind of silence that has furniture in it. Brielle had the passenger window down 2 inches and was watching the landscape change from suburb to country. Adrian drove the way he did everything, economically, without wasted motion. He had one hand on the wheel. The radio was on low, something instrumental, and she had a vague memory of a time when she would have reached over and changed it to something she actually wanted to hear, and he would have made a face, and she would have laughed at the face. She didn't reach over. She watched the dark tree lines. "You've been quiet this week," she said, not because she particularly wanted the conversation, but because the silence had started to feel like a question she hadn't answered. "I've been busy," he said. "With the Moreno account?" "Partly." She waited. He didn't add anything. This was the thing about Adrian that she had once found restful and had slowly come to find, if she was honest, somewhat maddening. He answered the question asked and no more. He didn't volunteer. He didn't editorialize. You could never tell from his face or his tone what the subtext was, whether partly meant yes, mostly, or no, something else entirely. "But I'm not going to tell you what." She turned to look at him. "Are you all right?" He glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. "Fine. Are you?" "I asked first." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, I noticed. They arrived at the vineyard as the last of the sun was going down, and the party was already shaped the way parties at that scale always are, clusters of people with glasses in hand, the sound of many simultaneous conversations creating a low, pleasant roar, fairy lights strung between posts in the terrace area, the smell of wood smoke from somewhere. Brielle felt herself relax incrementally in the way that she always did when she entered a social environment. It was like a muscle she could engage, almost involuntarily. Marcus found them within 10 minutes. He was in a dark jacket, animated, already holding a glass of something red. He greeted Adrian with a handshake and Brielle with a brief hug, and then he drew them both into the group he'd been standing with, colleagues of Joanna's. A couple from the next town over, a woman named Petra, who did something with architecture. The conversation was easy. Marcus was good at easy conversations. He had a quality that Adrian lacked, or perhaps had deliberately set aside, the ability to make lightness seem effortless. Adrian drank slowly and contributed when he had something specific to say, and was, objectively, good company in the way that competent people are. But Brielle noticed him watching the edges of things, the parking area, the terrace steps. He did this at parties, oriented himself spatially, seemed to be cataloging exits. She had asked him about it once, early in their marriage, and he had said simply, "Old habit." And she had understood this as evidence of some fascinating interior life she hadn't yet accessed. Now she wondered if it was just a tic. Now she wondered how many things she had once read as depth that were simply behavior. She had a second glass of wine, then a third. She and Petra ended up talking about something cities, she thought afterward. Or maybe the experience of living in a place that had changed without you quite noticing. She lost track of Adrian at some point. This was normal. They didn't orbit each other at parties. They were not that kind of couple, or hadn't been, for years. She went inside to find the bathroom, and on her way back through the long hallway that connected the interior of the main building to the terrace, she passed a small reading room off to the right door, half open, lamp on inside, and she paused. She had meant to stop because she thought she'd left her jacket in there earlier. She hadn't, but she paused anyway and looked in, and what she saw rearranged something in her chest without announcing what exactly it was doing. Marcus was in the room. He was talking to her, to Brielle, but she realized with a slight lurching confusion that he was talking to no one. Or rather, he was standing facing the window, which was dark, and he was saying something softly. And then he seemed to realize she was in the doorway, and he turned, and his face did something complicated. "I thought you were someone else," he said. "Who?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't parse, something that lived between apology and calculation. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe someone watching. Maybe like..." And here he stopped and looked around the room as if seeing it differently, and said in a tone that was half joking and wholly strange, "Maybe like this story. Or, I don't know, subscribe or something." Brielle stared at him. He blinked. The moment passed, or rather, he let it pass, deliberately, the way you close a drawer you've opened by accident. "Sorry," he said. "I've had too much wine." She didn't ask what he meant. She told herself it was the wine for him too. But she stood in the doorway for a moment longer than she should have, feeling, without knowing why, that something had been briefly visible that was not supposed to be some seam in the fabric of the evening. And then it had closed again, and the party sounds came back, and she went to find her husband. She found him, 20 minutes later, at the far end of the terrace. Alone, which was unusual, looking out over the darkened vineyard rows with a stillness that she recognized, suddenly and uncomfortably, as sadness. She stood beside him. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. After a while, he said, "Ready to go soon?" "Not yet," she said. He nodded. "Okay." She went back inside. He stayed where he was. An hour later, she kissed Marcus Webb in the narrow corridor beside the catering kitchen. It was not, and this was the thing she would return to, again and again in the weeks that followed. It was not a passionate thing. It was not the culmination of a secret burning desire. It was something that happened in the space between 2 glasses of wine and a husband standing alone on a terrace, looking sad in a way he would never explain, and a man who laughed easily and had spent a year finding reasons to knock on her door. Marcus had touched her arm in the hallway. She had turned. He had looked at her in a way that Adrian had stopped looking at her, or perhaps had never looked at her. She couldn't be sure anymore. And then it had simply happened. The way things happen when you've been waiting for someone to make a decision you're not willing to make yourself. It lasted perhaps 8 seconds. When it ended, she stepped back. He didn't pursue it. He said her name once, quietly, and she shook her head slightly, and that was all. She went to find her jacket. She found instead the particular absence that is worse than absence. The place where Adrian had been standing on the terrace, empty. His glass still on the railing. She looked around the terrace, then inside, then asked a woman from their street if she'd seen him. "He left," the woman said. "Maybe 15 minutes ago. He said he called you a car." He had. The notification was already on her phone when she checked. She rode home alone in the car. The driver didn't speak. She looked out the window at the dark and tried to understand what she felt, and what she arrived at was not guilt exactly. Or not only guilt. It was the specific and nauseating recognition that Adrian had been present the whole evening in a way she had failed to see, and now he was gone, and she had no idea what he'd witnessed, or for how long, or what it had done to him. He was not at the house when she arrived. His car was in the driveway. His jacket was on the hook in the entryway. She walked through the rooms quietly, as though a loud footstep might change something, and found him eventually in his study, the small room off the back hall, that was entirely his, that she rarely entered, sitting at his desk, with nothing in front of him. The desk lamp was on, he was simply sitting. She stood in the doorway. "Adrian." He looked at her. His expression was not angry. This was what frightened her most. It was the expression of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at a result and was now quietly accepting it. "You don't have to explain anything," he said. "I want to, I know." A pause. "I don't think it would help." She came into the room. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the chair that was there for clients, occasionally when he worked from home. She felt the peculiarity of this, being a guest in her husband's study. "I'm not," she started. It wasn't what it looked like. Or it was, but it wasn't what it meant. He listened. He let her finish. "I don't love him," she said. "I want you to know that." "I believe you," Adrian said. "But—" He looked at his hands for a moment. "There's no but, Brielle. I believe you. I also believe that something has been wrong for a long time. And I think—" He paused carefully. "I think I've known and done nothing, and that's mine to carry. But I don't know how to unknow what I now know. We could talk about it. We could. We've had 8 years to talk about it," he said. Not unkindly, just accurately. The room was very quiet. "So what happens now?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know yet," he said. "I need to think. Adrian, I need to think," he said again, gently. And it was final in the way that his gentleness was always final. Not a door slamming, but a door closing, quietly, with intention. She left him there. She went upstairs. She lay on top of the covers and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her and thought for the first time in perhaps years about what Adrian actually did in that study, what he managed, what he held together. She realized she didn't fully know. She had let him carry all of it because it had been easier and because he was so capable and because she had confused his capability with his willingness to bear it forever. Sometime around 2 in the morning, she fell asleep. When she woke at 7, his side of the bed was undisturbed. She went downstairs. The study was empty. His car was gone. She told Cassandra first, and the version she told was the one that cast the longest shadow on Adrian. The distance, the silence, the years of emotional unavailability. She told it with enough truth to feel honest and enough editing to feel, if not absolved, then at least understandable. Cassandra listened carefully and said at the end, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know where he is," Brielle said. "Have you tried calling?" "He picks up. He says he's fine. He says he needs time." "And you believe him?" She hadn't answered that. He had taken a long-term rental on an apartment across the city. She'd found this out through a mutual colleague, not through Adrian directly. He was still working, still managing the accounts, the investments, the 3 properties they owned jointly, the holdings she had never had reason to think closely about. He did not stop. He did not unravel. He simply moved his quiet, organized life to another address and continued. The first sign that things were different came 6 weeks later, when her corporate card was declined at a lunch she'd been certain was covered under their joint business account. She called the bank. There was a freeze on the account, not a seizure, not a fraud flag, but a restructuring. Adrian had filed paperwork she hadn't known to anticipate. The money was still technically accessible, but only through procedures that required her signature on documents she hadn't yet reviewed. She called their accountant, Leonard, who was deeply uncomfortable, and said in the careful way of a man trying not to become a casualty, that Adrian had been in touch and that a number of things were being reorganized. He suggested she retain her own financial counsel. She sat with that for a long time. There were other things, small ones. At first, a subscription service lapsed that she'd never managed herself. An automatic payment for the alarm monitoring company that she didn't know the login for. A lease on a storage unit she hadn't known existed, where, she eventually discovered, Adrian kept files she had never thought to ask about. 3 boxes of documents relating to the properties, tax records going back to before their marriage, a folder with her name on it that contained, neatly organized, every major financial decision he had made on her behalf over 8 years. The investment accounts, the insurance policies, the trust documents he'd set up when her mother had been ill, and Brielle had been too overwhelmed to track the details. He had built a structure around her life so quietly that she had never felt it as a structure. It had simply been the ground she stood on. She was not without resources. She had her own income, her own accounts. She was not, as she kept telling herself, helpless. But the scope of what she'd allowed to be delegated by default, through inattention and an implicit faith that he would always be there to manage it, was only now becoming visible, the way a cast comes off, and you see the arm that's been inside it, thin and strange. She didn't speak to Marcus. He'd sent 2 messages in the week after the party, both measured and brief, and she'd responded to neither. Whatever that evening had been, it had not been the beginning of something. It had been the end of something. She understood this now. She thought about Adrian at the party, alone on the terrace. She thought about how long he had been standing there before she noticed, and how long after she'd noticed she had still done nothing and gone back inside and let the evening continue. She thought about Cassandra's tilted head years ago. Does that ever feel strange? She started, around month 3, working with a financial advisor named Ruth, who was thorough and patient and asked questions that Brielle sometimes couldn't answer. When was this account opened? Who holds the trustee position on this policy? Do you have access to the property management portal? Questions that Adrian could have answered without pausing. Questions that revealed, with each repetition, a map of all the places she had not thought to look. She was not bitter exactly. That surprised her. She had expected to be bitter, had expected to find in the architecture of his competence something punitive, some deliberate withholding designed to leave her vulnerable. But the more she understood what he'd built, the less it looked like a trap, and the more it looked like what it was. A man who had organized everything because organizing things was his way of loving, and who had perhaps never fully taught her to share the structure because she had never fully asked. That was the part she sat with longest. She had let him carry it. She had let him carry all of it and called it trust and called it reliance. And somewhere in there had stopped reaching for him in the ways that mattered. They met in the end at the house. She'd asked, and he'd agreed without difficulty. He arrived at 11 in the morning on a Thursday, 8 months after the night at the vineyard. He looked, she searched for the word and found it lighter, not happier necessarily, but as though something that had been arranged tightly behind his eyes had loosened slightly. He made coffee. She let him, because it was still his kitchen as much as hers, and because the alternative was standing in the doorway watching him, and she wasn't sure she could bear that. They sat at the kitchen table. His laptop was not open. Her phone was face down. Outside, it was a gray November morning, the kind that makes everything feel considered. "How are you?" she asked. "Good," he said. "Really, you. Getting there." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I've been working with Ruth Calloway on the—" "I know. She mentioned you've been thorough." A pause. "That's good. I didn't know half of what you'd set up." "I should have walked you through it more," he said. "That's on me. I wanted to." He stopped. "I think I wanted to feel necessary, and I think that's not the same thing as wanting you to actually understand it." She looked at him. That was more than he'd said in probably a year of marriage, in terms of real admission, and he'd said it plainly, without drama. "I wasn't paying attention," she said. "No, I mean to you, not just the finances. I wasn't paying attention to you." He turned his coffee cup slightly on the table. "I know. That's not—" She stopped. Started again. "I'm not saying that as an excuse for what I did. There's no excuse for that." "I know that too," he said quietly. The room held the silence comfortably, the way rooms do when they have absorbed enough difficult conversations to have grown familiar with them. "I've been trying to understand," Brielle said, "what I thought was happening with us. I think I told myself it was just what long marriages look like, that the distance was normal, that you were fine with it because you seemed fine. I'm very good at seeming fine." "Yes," she said, "you are." He looked out the window at the gray yard. "I'm not asking you to feel responsible for. I don't think it's useful to spend too much time on who let what happen. I did my own letting." "But," he half smiled, not bitterly, "but I think we had a marriage where we were both waiting for the other person to say the thing, and neither of us said it. And then it was too late. And I think—" He paused. "I think I could have said something, 100 times. I chose not to, because saying it would have made it real, and I wasn't ready for that." She felt, very clearly, the weight of that, not as accusation as recognition. She had done the same thing, had circled the truth of their growing distance, The way you circle a word you're not sure how to pronounce, choosing to leave it alone rather than risk being wrong. Are you happy? She asked. Now? He considered this genuinely, which she appreciated. I think I'm on my way to being honest, he said. Which I think comes first. She nodded. They finished their coffee. He rinsed both cups at the sink, this reflex, this unkillable tidiness. And then he dried his hands and turned around, and they were standing in the kitchen that had once held all those Saturday mornings, the coffee and the laptops and the morning and the toast she used to steal. I don't regret us, she said. I want you to know that. I regret what I did with what we had. He looked at her for a long moment, something in his face that she couldn't name, not forgiveness, not its absence either. Something older than both. I know, he said. He picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. Take care of yourself, Brielle. You too, she said. The door closed. Not hard. Not soft. Just closed. With exactly the pressure required. She stood in the kitchen for a while. The house was very quiet. It was the same quiet it had always been on Saturday mornings. The same quality of air, the same light coming through the east window. But it felt different now, and she understood that the difference was not in the house. She had spent 8 years in a structure she had never examined. She had confused the holding of things together with the things themselves. She had looked at a man who carried everything quietly and called it his nature, when it was actually his choice, a choice he had made. Every day for her, in the only language he knew. And she had stopped listening. She picked up her phone from the table. She put it back down. She poured the rest of the coffee that remained in the pot down the drain, watching it go. And then she rinsed the pot the way he would have, carefully, without waste. It was a small thing. It felt, for reasons she couldn't explain to anyone, important. Outside, Adrian Cole sat in his car for 3 minutes before starting the engine. He was not crying. He was not angry. He was doing what he had always done in moments that mattered, sitting with the full weight of a thing, letting it be real before moving forward. Then he started the engine, and he drove.